that I thought very highly of my dad's eldest brother, who was a school principal. Back in those early years, they called him professor, and he was a Mason in Harlingen, Texas, and Hondo, Texas, and was impressed, very favorable by my mother's dear friend. His husband was a doctor in Dallas in 1939. And remember, I don't know if he was, well, this is how it happened. I was born with a large hairy mole covering about half of my right forehead. In those years, only movie stars and wealthy people had plastic surgery in their countenance anyway. And my mother wanted me to have it removed. She had no idea how. And she talked with her friend who talked with her husband. I don't know if he was Scottish Rite or if he's Shriner or both. In those early years, I didn't really know, but I went through 3 different surgeries. And my right eyebrow is tailor-made, and very few people know it. I think he did as well. He had the reputation of being the foremost in the Dallas area. And he was experienced in it in World War I and continued his practice in Dallas and elsewhere, but his headquarters were Dallas. And my childhood home was a small farm northeast of Greenville, 10 miles. Greenville, Jacobia Community, or Dumpto. Well, you weren't there in the 30s and early 40s then. Yeah, the middle 20s. And when I went to Tech in 1941, I pulled off the final bandage August 31st, 1941. No one in Lubbock or Tech ever saw me with my birthmark. No one in my home ever saw me without it. And I went to my 20th high school reunion, and I was sitting behind 2 of those tough old senior girls that I remembered. And they were looking at an annual and says, "There's one son of a bitch I'll know, I'll recognize." And I looked over and they were looking at my picture in the annual. And I said, "Oh, what makes you think so?" I said, "Well, look." And I said, "I don't have to look, that's me." And they didn't recognize me. My uncle saw me on the street. He didn't recognize me because he's so used to seeing me, as they said, with the black eye. So much for ancient history, okay? Well, in my application, and the committee asked me that same question, and I said, due to the people that were outstanding in my memory, I thought were fine people. And they were good to me anyway, and good for me. And I thought, if they are, and I could, it'd help me be that kind of man when I grew up. And after I saved up the money, I petitioned, and that was in Lubbock, Yell House, famous old Yell House Lodge, in Canyon, Yell House Canyon. It was a pioneer landmark, I guess, in the Panhandle. Yeah, and that is where I petitioned after I came back from the war. I was traveling then. I took that all-expense paid tour of Europe, met the Russians at St. Egdon, and we withdrew to Neuhausen, a hotel. I didn't know it at the time, but my instrument man and I stayed in his quarters. He had an old trunk in there, and we fished through it. In the bottom, I found a saber. And I said, "Look, Bob, this old man's probably a Nazi emblem on it." It was a Knight Templar emblem. And in those years, Germany had to turn in all of their knives with more than 4 inches at the Rathaus City Hall. He didn't turn that one in. And some 5 years later, I became a Knight Templar, and I thought, wow, that's the saber I found in Germany. And I wasn't a Mason then, of course, and I didn't know it. But yeah, a little bit of I went back to college. I had bitter financial difficulties, as everyone did in those years. Yes, otherwise I'd probably starved. Yes, but I left college and I went to work, and the only full-time job that I had all my adult life, I was with the GTE, General Telephone System, the Yellow Pages. I was a Yellow Pages representative. I did it for almost 40 years, retiring in Dallas. I've been in every one of the 50 states, either working there, driving through to go to work. 1985, and during that time I was never home, and Lodge was meeting. I petitioned the Lodge after I'd saved up enough money. As I'd been working for 2 or 3 years. That is when I started, and I was never home except weekends, and consequently I was never an officer in the Lodge, never. Everyone suspects that I was due to my seniority. I wasn't too good at golf, but I did participate, and I wasn't too good at nighttime happy hour poker. I would look around, and if I could see a square and compass light on a building, I'd knock on the door and go to lodge. And I've been to many, many lodges. I'd see the same people in some small county seat town in state far away from my home, and I'd see the same people if I went to church that I saw calling on them, or I'd see them in lodge. And of course my happiest time was in airport. Took that opportunity, and when I petitioned the lodge, was going through the degrees, I would rent a little airplane, maybe 300-400 miles away, and fly into Lubbock and run upstairs and go to lodge. And that earned me a reputation. And I flew him also. He wanted me to take him to Austin to go out to a little country lodge. So we landed in a pasture near the little town. Went to lodge that night. He says, "You're young and you can do it. And then you could pop for me in Lubbock and I'll go to lodge." So that was what that's for. Oh, he couldn't. He wanted me to fly over. I didn't know what we were doing. And then it came time for us to go to this fancy club in the valley, and these people came up in a beautiful new expensive automobile, and they had rings and double eagle. My neighbor, a friend, scolded him very bluntly and said, "Hey," had him drive an airplane around over my orchard and said, "Right next to the road, 50 feet away, it's clear, but you haven't done what you were paid to do back from that. You didn't get your check this month. You're not going to get another one either till you clean up my orchard." Citrus farm, very, very expensive. Yeah, so that was, one of my many experiences. I should say, be careful. And I was a freshman, and the upperclassmen, and I didn't know it at the time, they were studying for the ministry. And in the youth fellowship, one was president, the other was vice president, and he said, "Freshmen, you will go to church with us. It'll be Idaloo, 12 miles out of Lubbock, and you will wear a coat and tie, and you'll behave, and we're bringing a good-looking blonde." And I said, no, I won't believe that. So that evening I school hopped out of my residence there. It was a Wrangler Fraternity Hall. And I went out to the car. I had my tie just over my shoulder. And I had my coat arm, and I looked in the back seat. And I said, "Wow, sure enough, you didn't lie." So I crawled in, visited with her, and I insisted we get together after that brief meeting. "Oh, I've got a date." But she says, "You know what? I'll late date you if you like." Says, "After this," says, "we'll be out of there for 9. And says, he takes me home. We'll go for a walk and we'll visit." I said, "Great." And I remember to this day, it is sort of like last week, full moon, and it was a total eclipse. And then it rained in Lubbock. Wow. And then she was in McMurray, and she was studying religion, and she wanted to marry a preacher and stay working in the church. She had a friend from here that was in my chemistry lab in Lubbock. Her name is Bigamy, and they called her Bigamy. Said, "Hey, Bigamy, he ain't going to be a preacher." And she said, "Yeah, I know." Says, "As a matter of fact, he doesn't remind me at all of a preacher." We went together for a couple of years, and I went into the service, and we were married in Coffee County, Alabama, when she graduated. She graduated 28th of May, and we married June the 3rd. And then I left overseas to her. I came back. We lived in Abilene briefly. And then she went to work in Lubbock, and she worked at the church for years until our boys started school. She quit and went to work for the school system. She was home when the boys were, which was good, I thought. Yep. And so much for my private life. And had nothing to do with the lodge. He was in East Texas, a school principal in Yowell, Texas. And that's where my wife was born. It's about, somewhere between 12 and 20 miles from my childhood home. In those years, Snyder had difficulty keeping a school teacher because those rough old ranch boys had run them off. One of the men knew. My wife's dad says, well, there's no red-headed boy down in East Texas that'll straighten him out if you get him to come out here. They got in their pickup and drove to Yowell from Snyder, Strayhorn. They told him what they wanted and asked him what he'd want to move. And he told me later, he said, I just put my salary up where I knew they'd get in that old pickup and leave. And said, the leader of that group, can you be there Monday morning? And he said, well, I made the deal. Well, and it's a considerable raise. Yeah. So he got in that Model T Ford and drove to Strayhorn. He stayed there until the oil boom in Big Spring, and he got an $80 raise going from the school to the post office, and that's where he retired. He bought 4 more, and he leased his friend of the banker. Otherwise, in the Depression, he wouldn't have made it. And I live in a home. They lived in town until the 60s. Moved out to the farm. That old white building there, those 2 rooms that he moved over and put on that old house, he built at the, what we now call the Holy Grail. The Wooten Farm, the first place he bought, and they lived out there in the summertime. Yeah, and he was very active in the lodge. He was a good one. And after I was into the lodge in Lubbock, he came up and picked me up and took me to Grand Lodge with him in Waco. And that was an experience. I've been to 6 shrine imperial sessions, purely by accident on 2 of them, or 3. I was in Las Vegas. The crowds on the street, I had to pull over and stop. And I looked, here comes a shrine parade. So I participated in that. And later in Lubbock, when our boys grew up, they worked at the airport, partners of the Beechcraft dealership. I signed his petition, and we went to the Imperial Session in Canada. I marched 9 miles that parade. That's about the only outstanding things in my earlier years. I had been very favorably impressed when I had my eyebrow tailored, and I had a little knowledge of some of my friends in Dallas when I lived in Greenville. I thought that that would be a way to contribute something back, and I did. You mentioned when we retired, and I've always loved airports, airport people, and airplanes, and I continued that, and I didn't have to worry about anything I left on my desk. Went to the airport, mooched coffee. The secretary at the FBO out there had a little baby with a club foot. Her husband worked at the John Deere Implement Company. The lady out there told the young man that was the father of that little baby, said, well, if they knew a Mason, they could get that child fixed. I was there drinking coffee. This lady said, well, what's a Mason? And the shop foreman, young fellow, he said, oh, it's an old man like Orville. And I'd have felt honored if you'd have said a young man like Orville. But I went to the lodge and I got an application. Took back to him, and 3 weeks later, that child foot had surgery. I don't know much about the follow-up on it, how it worked in later years. But I thought that was gratifying. Fixed base operator, the person that runs the airport dealership and the hangar to there. That's a colloquialism for the boss of usually they have a contract with the city. He is the operator of the aviation part. The airport manager does a lot of additional things. A lot of people think differently, but there's a tremendous amount of money involved in that airport. I mean, a lot. And very few people know it, but Big Spring has the longest runway of any non-towered airport in the state of Texas. They can land fighters, big jets, little jets, fast jets. The outstanding part of that, it's an industrial airport. Air park means a small runway with houses and hangars to it. They call it Big Spring Air Park. It's not an air park. It's an industrial airport, even though there's no tower or control tower. I wanted to fly in the Air Force, and Air Corps, it was called in those years. And I wanted to fly one of them Army planes. I got into service, and I was too young to volunteer, but I was drafted and told them I wanted to go to the Air Corps. They said, well, tell them tomorrow after you're sworn in, in all probability you'll be in San Antonio tomorrow night. Well, I told them. I was on KP at Mineral Wells, the Infantry Induction Center, and I went from there to Shepherd Field, and they were going to decide what to do with me. I have what's called euphoria. It's a weak muscle in my right eye. Lay me on my side, I'll see a double vision. And I told the flight surgeon, no problem, I'll shoot both of them. Not a damn thing you can do, son. Going back to your unit. I did. I went to the chemical center in the hot, steamy summer in Alabama. I am a certified toxic gas handler. I know how to handle phosgene, phosphorus, mustard gas, and I'm expert. And do you know, coming back from the war, a pilot gets a job, a mechanic gets a job, but there wasn't a job anywhere. They wanted to hire an expert man to kill people with poison gas. So I had to work hard for a living. All right, 70. Yep. Well, you said, you mind your boss, you mind the doctor, you mind your lawyer, and if you want to be happy, you better mind your wife. And shortly after we were married, I went to work traveling, and I was home only on weekends. So I guess maybe I was married for 70 years, but only home about half that much or less. I went to a lot of interesting places, and I visited lodge where I could, and I've been to the largest membership lodge in the world, and I've been, I believe, to the smallest membership, Beaver City in the Panhandle of Oklahoma. Wichita Albert Pike Lodge in Wichita, Kansas. Do much in the shrine or the York Rite anymore. Yeah, I go occasionally. But due to the fact I was never home during the week, I never was an officer, never went through the chairs, as you say. But I thought, enough is too much memberships, and I could keep up with, really. Well, I married into here in 44, and I visited frequently from 42 to 44, and I was down here when I was home on weekends frequently, particularly when the boys were preschool age. We spent as many weekends as we could here. If I was in San Angelo or Rio Grande Valley, I'd meet them here. And like if I was up in Kansas or Colorado, we'd meet in Amarillo. So we were in a lot of different places. I went to a lodge, and I was working in Honolulu. Sent my wife out to buy me one of those Hawaiian shirts, took off my tie and jacket, knocked on the door. Guess what? They were in tuxedos. La Plagua de Oceana Lodge in Honolulu was originally under French jurisdiction. They still meet in tuxedos, or did when I was there. Office in Long Beach and Santa Monica. Lived in Costa Mesa Verde Country Club. So much for the usual. Everywhere. Well, did almost everything. And I thought the man that hired me in Lubbock was from Long Beach. I mean, he officed in Long Beach. He's originally from Missouri, Illinois. I think that, a lot of different interesting aspects of work, business. I volunteered for foreign duty. He was the regional vice president of the Orient, and thought we'd go to Kuala Lumpur, and they sent us to Houston as I was director of new ventures. And they didn't tell me that. They said, I understood they bought it. They went into partners with those crooks. And I was there about 18 months. They would buy something and charge, a new truck. They'd drive it to South America and sell it. We didn't need for them to have a truck, but they were partners and they took advantage of it. And I reported to the vice president of finance after I told him that, there's their young Jewish vice president that handled money told me that he was resigning, getting his stock out. Said there's some things going on. And I said, yes, I suspicion it and I believe I know it. He said, oh, that's enough. And he said, my dad always taught me don't do those things. So he left, and I told my boss, the vice president of finance for GTE, that we should, he said, don't worry about it. We've got a little clause in there that says, after, I believe it was 2 years or year and a half, that either party could leave. And we did, and that's when I went to Dallas. And that's where I retired. and I wasn't the highest paid vice president. But everything in life doesn't work out like you plan it. Yeah, passed away last week. And lost my number one son. He went to the Air Force Academy. He retired from the Air Force. He retired from the airline, and they were treating him for an ulcer. And he had esophageal cancer, and he passed away 2 years later. My baby son is in Santa Fe, but he'll be here tomorrow night, Michael. The other was Junior, William Orville Jr., and if he didn't like that, he shouldn't have been a girl to the day he was born. He could either be named Rita Gale or William Orville Jr. That's what we came up with. So I'm the other brother, they say. Not Orville right, Orville wrong.
Okay.
Baby grandson will be here tomorrow. Oh, yes. I stayed here when I worked La Mesa, Oklahoma, and Fort San Angelo. And it's one of the few places that had telephone booths. And the rate has changed a little. My room last year at the partnership meeting, we met here. And my room was $203. I've got it on out in the old barn there somewhere, my original expense report, where it was $3.50 or $3. And a lot of places, almost everywhere, $5 was normal then. I remember our vice president came to town, Texarkana, and they're standing at the desk, and the clerk was there, assistant manager, and he said, "Wow, here comes an $8 room if I ever saw one." And I started to say, "Well, I know him, and he's got the money." Morning Star was his name. On a small farm, you had homegrown vegetables, homegrown meat, milk, and all the garden vegetables. And I believe that homebrew was 80 cents a gallon, and we didn't drink. My kid brothers did. My younger, it's like I had two families. When I left for college, the youngsters in my family moved to the Gulf Coast. They partied and drank and smoked, and they passed away early. Kid brother was very, very wealthy. So he had a lot of pressure, I'm sure. His young wife taught him to swim, and they started water skiing. And he was the second man in the United States to ski barefooted. Of course, they had interesting lives, but I do feel like that my big brother and I did not smoke or drink. I drank a little brandy after dinner that the mayor taught me in France, Neuhausen, the hotel. And the owner was a Knight Templar. I found his saber. I didn't know what it was for several years afterwards, but I thought, Buchenwald. Wow. Yes, sir. I've got the pictures to prove it. And at the museum, the airport, Veteran of the Month, tell the stories. I never told them what combat is like. You know, they hear enough of those stories. We were not the ones that opened it. we were 2-3 days or a week later, but our commanding officer, colonel, was Jewish. He ordered everyone in his command to go through tour Buchenwald. I've got the pictures, the guides. I've got pictures of the crematorium. There were still ashes there. For those that later years have said what experience didn't happen, I can't call the name now. Yes, it did happen. Was not really happening. It did happen, and I witnessed some of the worst parts, I thought. Buchenwald was not one of the harshest, probably, or the worst, but it was plenty enough to almost make one believe that it's almost impossible to vision. Yep. Well, I've told you a lot more than I know.